All right, you want to go ahead and get started?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so I'll introduce myself and I'll let you introduce yourself. So hi, everybody. My name is Annie Klodd. I'm one of the statewide extension educators at University of Minnesota covering fruits and vegetables. And a lot of the recommendations we give are organic recommendations because according to our needs assessment, 76% of farmers growing fruit and vegetable crops in Minnesota are growing organically. So we're excited to be focusing on organic day neutral strawberries today. We give a number of field days during the year usually, and now we're pivoting everything to online education until we can get back out in the field later this summer. So that's my thing.
Excellent. I'm Courtney Tchida. I am now with the Minnesota State Horticultural Society. I've been with them since about February, so just a couple months. And before that, I was at the University of Minnesota running the student organic farm for the last 15 years there. And we grew a lot of organic day neutral strawberries, and it was one of my favorite crops that we grew. First growing it with grad students doing research projects, and then as all of them graduated, then taking that on myself. The last two seasons, the first season, it was in 2018, it was kind of a flop for me and I learned a lot. And then last year was actually really quite successful. So I feel good to be able to sort of steer growers in terms of like what pitfalls to avoid. So excellent.
Awesome. All right, well, I'll go to the next slide. I have control of the slides. So Courtney, when we do your slides, just let me know when I need to advance. All right, so let's start out from kind of a broad perspective. Why are we talking about day neutral strawberries? Most people on the webinar today have probably heard something about them. Some may have had experience growing them so far, some not. So this is something where University of Minnesota has been doing a lot of research on day neutral strawberries for the past few years, and a lot of other universities like Cornell and North Carolina State have been doing quite a bit of research on the system as well. California has developed a lot of day neutral strawberry varieties, and there are quite a few available now that can be grown really successfully in Minnesota. So if you look at the picture on the left, that's a traditional June-bearing strawberry field. So they're grown as a perennial, survive about 3 to 5 years, and straw is really important in that system. On the right, you see what a day neutral system may look like. A lot of growers grow day neutrals under what's called a low tunnel. So that's that system that you see right there. Others will grow them in high tunnels or caterpillar tunnels. They're often grown on plasticulture with some sort of mulch or cover crop in the rows in between. So a little closer look at June-bearing strawberries. As I said, perennials. They fruit for 3 to 5 years before they are removed and replaced with new plants. Typically, their fields are rotated, so you're typically not just tearing out a field of strawberries and planting a new one right on top of that. Typically, it involves a rotation with a cover crop or a different crop. The harvest is about 3 to 4 weeks in late June through early July, so it's really packed into that small amount of time. And they spread and fill the row via runners, and they grow on straw, and they're covered in straw over the winter. So not going to be focusing on that system today. We're going to be talking about day neutral strawberries. In Minnesota, we grow day neutral strawberries as an annual. They can be grown as a perennial. That works better typically in other parts of the country where their winters aren't so cold and they might have a little bit less disease pressure. In Minnesota, we grow them as annuals typically. And the harvest period is about 14 weeks more or less, from late June to October. So we start harvesting these at the same time as we start harvesting June-bearing strawberries, but then the season just keeps on going. They are removed in the fall, so whatever mulch you're growing them on has to be removed as well as the plants. And typically they're grown on plastic mulch, raised matted rows, like I mentioned before. One thing that's really compelling about the system is that they typically have significantly higher yields than June-bearing strawberries. So if you're thinking about a crop that you want to have all season long, be able to bring strawberries to the market late in the season, like August, September, even October, this can be a really compelling crop for you. Also, the yields are significantly higher over the season, and each plant can produce between, one study I was looking at that was specific to Minnesota said up to 1 pound per plant. If you look at other resources from other parts of the country, they might say something like 1 to 1.5 pounds per plant, somewhere in there.
Awesome. We have two, wait, go back 1 second. We have a couple questions. There's a question about, Chris wants to know if any U-pick farms in Minnesota have had success switching to the longer picking season with day neutrals instead of just the traditional U-pick. Do you know of any?
Oh, so specifically U-pick farms, I'm not sure, but there are farms that do direct on-farm sales of day neutral strawberries, and they have been successful with that. I don't know if I'm supposed to give farm names. If they're not on here, they might not. I don't know if they want me to give their names. But I do know several farms who are successfully selling these on the farm throughout the season. So got people picking blueberries, raspberries, apples later in the season. They have day neutral strawberries available in the farm shed for purchase. I know of a farm that sells these all season at the St. Paul Farmers Market as well, which, you know, it's amazing. You're walking through the farmers market and you see strawberries in September. That's pretty cool. But
yeah, Lori says that she does U-pick from May till the end of August with TriStar and Fort Laramie. So we have one participant who can vouch for this system.
Awesome.
Yeah. I'm going to wait for the other questions because I think we'll loop around back to them. Lori Cox did want to know, loved the stat of 76% of growers growing organically and was curious about the source. And that was from the survey of growers, correct?
Yep. So we put out UMN Extension, specifically me and Natalie Hoytel, we put out a needs assessment survey in the beginning of 2019, so a year and a half ago. We tried to advertise that far and wide, so you should have probably heard about it. And so that statistic is from that data.
Perfect. Okay, now we can forge ahead with the variety info. So the varieties that we're highlighting here are kind of the most common ones that the U of M has done a lot of research with. Albion is one of the ones with the highest yield and largest berries. It needs really consistent watering and nutrition, especially in the form of nitrogen. It's resistant to verticillium wilt and Phytophthora crown rot and has some resistance to anthracnose. This one I found, especially last year, that it lagged a little bit behind some of the other varieties that I was growing, but it definitely it finished a lot stronger than the other varieties too. So I think that it's kind of nice to have a combination of some of these varieties and not just all one variety as you go forward. Next slide.
Sorry, there we go.
Seascape, this is another one that is kind of touted as a top performer. It was actually one of the ones that had the lowest yields at the U of M studies that have been done on yield trials. It starts out smaller, but then it typically increases in size and has a really good flavor. Keep going. EV2, this is another one that's really easy to grow. It's really high yielding. It's less sensitive to warmer temps, so a lot of times it won't slow down in the middle of the season and will keep going pretty steady. It has really nice flavor as well. Portola has a little bit lighter in color and should be harvested before it's fully red. This one has a really good flavor. It has a little bit lower sugar compared to Albion, but I actually think it's one of the, once it's almost in that like super ripe phase, it can be really sweet. It's high yielding, it ripens as early as EV2, and it is, however, susceptible to leaf spot. So that's one that I've definitely experienced a lot of leaf spot with and have kind of shied away from going forward. And that one actually had the highest yields within the University of Minnesota study. And with the study was definitely, all of the ones did better with plastic and low tunnels, which we'll talk about, versus the ones grown on straw had the lowest yields.
Yeah, and I just want to add one note, between Portola and Albion, even though Portola had the highest yields in the U of M trial, which was at farms and at the St. Paul Organic Farm, they really seem to recommend Albion out of that trial because it's still high yielding, but it also has higher sugar. But if you're really going for highest yields, yeah, Portola was the highest yielding.
San Andreas is another one. It has one of the largest berries. It's really consistent. It's a little bit lighter than most day neutrals. And then I think the last one, oh, is Cabrillo. And this is one of the newest day neutral varieties from California. It has a lot of disease resistance, which I think is something that people are having issues with. And so it's nice to see that the breeding is kind of moving towards that as well. It does have a little bit of susceptibility to the anthracnose crown rot too. And the sources that we've consistently been finding them, Norse Farm is where I've always gotten them from. I know Annie got some from AgriSource Company, which is a nice Minnesota local company as well. You can get some through Burpee, some through Johnny's as well, have some of these varieties. Yeah.
All right. Do we have a question?
Oh, yeah.
Does Extension, is this list of varieties posted? And so I can send a link to the list of varieties and the comparison of yields to everybody who registered for the webinar. Yep.
Excellent. There's a question about if customers keep coming back all summer, if they're trained that Minnesota U-Pick strawberries are done in July. For me, we had them at the farmers market on the Minneapolis campus, and people quickly learned that we had them all season long and would come back for them quickly. On contrast, like going to the Mill City Farmers Market, I would bring my son every week and I'd have to train him that no, they're only available in June for a couple weeks, and then we have to kind of just wait, or I have to bring them home from the farm. So yeah, I think people are excited and they definitely draw a crowd to your stand. Off season.
Chris, in the area where your farm is, I don't know how many other farmers in your area are growing day neutral. So if you have other customers coming out throughout the season to pick other berry crops, it might be something you could just experiment with a few rows and see how customers latch onto it. If they keep asking for them, if they keep coming back to pick them when they're coming for other berries, you might just experiment with it a little bit and see, because I think the response from customers might vary depending on where you are in the state. But maybe Lori could type in a response about what her experience has been with that too. And then somebody asked, do these vendors typically run out? I'm assuming you mean run out of the plants. And I would say if you are trying to buy day neutral plants to plant yet this season, you would be limited by the varieties that are still available. But if you call AgriSource in Detroit Lakes, or if you look on the Norse website, you'll be able to see what's still available. I think though, for the most part, just like with ordering seeds or ordering other plants, most growers are ordering those in the winter or early spring before they want to plant. But if you're only wanting to try a smaller quantity, like a few rows for this season, you would have a better chance of still being able to get some for this year.
Yeah, when I checked on Norse Farm's website, they I think they were limiting to 100 plants of the different varieties that they still had left, but they still had a pretty good selection.
Yeah. And Courtney, here's a question for you. With these being annuals, do the certifiers require organic plants?
No, these aren't really available organically. In my experience of what I've been able to find, there's, I think there was maybe one variety last year that was listed on the groworganic.com website. But honestly, they're in such short supply out there that typically, because they're not available organic and because you're growing it as an annual, they're bare root, so that helps. You can grow them. And as long as your system is, or your field is organic, then they can be certified organic the first season. I was also going to say that I usually tried to order from Norse Farm in November, December, January, for sure by February 1st, kind of just to be able to get the order in and know that I'm going to get what I want.
Thanks. All right, so bed prep, we'll tag team this. So typically, day neutral strawberries are planted on matted rows with plasticulture. We'll talk about why plasticulture is so popular for this system, but the matted rows are important for drainage. They're important for making sure you've got nice soil that's not super compacted. And it also works with a drip line. So this is how the day neutral strawberry plantings are established at the Research Center in Morris. So much like if you're growing vegetables on plasticulture, it's very much the same sort of system. Courtney,
Yeah.
do you have anything to add from?
Having that kind of raised bed system seems to be ideal for these guys. In 2018, we didn't use raised beds, and then in 2019, we did. I'm not sure how much of a difference that really made. You kind of want to have a firm but fluffy soil, so you don't want it to be super compact, but you don't want it to be super, super loose either. And part of that is the way that it's planted, and you want to have good soil to root contact. Yeah. If you're, yeah.
I just want to see what question came up. All right, I'm going to get to your question soon, Matt. All right, so for mulching, this is talking about what you actually use in the rows. White on black plastic is very common. This is the most common system for commercial growers. Growers may wonder, can you use straw? Straw is really not recommended in this system. Part of that is based on research that always kept finding that when day neutrals are planted on straw, they produce the lowest yields as compared to black plastic or white on black plastic. If you're an urban farmer or growing for personal consumption on a really small scale, you may also use landscape fabric or weed mat. Landscape fabric, you know, it can last up to 10 years. And so this is definitely a benefit. But if you are planting on anything more than maybe a row, this is going to be a really hard material to work with because you're going to have to puncture holes in it. And using it multiple years in a row would be tough when you're puncturing holes to use for the plants.
And there's a question about, is white better than black? In my experience, and I haven't tried the black, but I've done the white on black pretty consistently. And I think it keeps like it holds the heat into the soil, but it reflects the light back. And I think that's why they recommend the white on black as opposed to just black. And there was a question from Star about, do any of these varieties grow in containers for urban setting? And I would say yes, go for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Irrigation is one of the kind of crucial pieces of this whole puzzle. Drip irrigation is definitely recommended. And then using a timer, especially so that you have consistent watering. You really want to water probably from 30 minutes to an hour, kind of, 1 to 3 times a week with the goal of getting like 1 to 2 inches of water per week on the plants. I definitely found that this was really, really important and crucial. I think last year we were doing, 30 minutes every other day throughout the season just to make sure that we had consistent watering, especially with the low tunnels and the plastic, because they're not getting a lot of rainwater. So even if it rains, you oftentimes want to make sure that they get good irrigation that's very consistent. So you have good development of flowers and fruit, and that water isn't a limiting factor. And that's also part of the wanting to have, the raised beds, so you have good drainage too, because you don't want them sitting wet all the time either. So it's a balance.
Yeah. And somebody added from the last slide that just a thought, black plastic could cause scorching of the berries that are lying on the plastic if it gets too hot.
Yep. Should we see if we can make this work?
Let's see. You never really know with videos if they're going to work or not. I think I actually have to
pull it out.
Yep.
And I think I moved it to like the 1:15 minute and 15 seconds to the part that's important.
Okay.
So this is a video from Norse Farm that is showing the planting technique. And first he's going to kind of do this little dance where he's showing how the soil is nice and firm. Yeah.
You want me to fast forward?
Yeah, fast forward up to like the 1:15 mark.
Okay.
So he's got a planting tool that he's using is kind of L-shaped. I actually just use like a wooden stake that is 12 inches long by 1 inch. But you basically take and you wrap a little bit of the roots underneath the bottom by about 1 inch. And then you don't want to do is what he's doing right there, where you make a big hole, because when you do that, it can actually not get that good soil root contact. So you actually just want to like using your stick, push the plants in right through it. You can even do it through plastic just fine, and that can work really well and be pretty easy. That's good. We can go back to the.
One of those things trying to of this.
Yep.
All right, there we go.
Perfect. Yeah, so you can see here, there's that wooden stick that we usually use. We usually just kind of laid it down. You also might want to trim, you want to keep the plants when you get them, keep them refrigerated until you can plant them. And then you want to give those roots another little trim before you plant them. I usually would just trim off like the bottom, I don't know, half inch to an inch of the roots just to give them a fresh cut. And then you kind of lay it out and go into there just like that. And the depth that you plant these at is really crucial. You want to do it at just right so that the crown is just sitting on at the soil level. You don't want them too deep. You don't want them too high. You don't really want the roots bent. So using that stick works really well for just pushing the roots straight down, which is nice. Spacing wise, typically we always planted these on about we used 4-foot wide plastic, and that gave us about a 3-foot to top of the bed that was 3 feet wide. And then we planted 2 double rows that were offset. And this worked fairly well in that you could kind of have the zigzag pattern, and it gave the plants just a little bit more room than if they were right across from each other. And the tool that we used, do you want to go one more?
Do you mind if I ask you just one question about this photo?
Yeah.
So when you guys laid out your field, did you have a plastic layer or did you have to do that more manually?
So we had a plastic layer. So I want to say like 2014 through 2017, Steve Poppy came with his plastic layer that had the double row of drip irrigation that it laid. It also like dibbled the plastic for us and showed like the spacing markings. Then in 2018 and 2019, we used a different one that only did 1 row of irrigation. So we would actually lay down 2 rows of irrigation before we put the plastic down. And then we did have I think this is probably the 2018 picture. Yep, it is, where we didn't raise the bed as much. So this picture is showing without the raised bed. I definitely recommend the raised bed if you have that option. But yeah, we did use a plastic layer, and then it didn't have it didn't perforate the holes to do the spacing, which is why we did what's on the next slide. So we used this roller dibbler from Johnny's, where we would just put in the dibbles. We put 6 dibbles, 3 on each side, so it did the double row offset, and just pulled it down the plastic and poked the holes really nicely for us. And then we were able to, it more just, I would say it poked the holes in the plastic that showed where the plants needed to go in. It didn't really dibble the soil that much. And so it worked really well to then be able to plant into that as well.
Somebody asked a question. Are both rows of drip tape in the middle or on the outside of the plants towards the buried edges?
I always did it in the middle.
Okay. All right, so if you've grown June-bearing strawberries before, you know that removing runners is a major task involved with growing these strawberries. But sometimes with June-bearing strawberries, you leave the runners, so obviously they can fill out the row. With day-neutral strawberries, we always remove the runners. We do not need those runners to fill out the row because the plants are limited to the hole that they are planted in, and we're not trying to use those for reproduction. So removing the runners is important, otherwise they can steal energy away from fruit production on the plant.
And this is super important. This is definitely one of the things that I did not do very well in 2018, and then I was really on top of in 2019, and we got much better production with. Also, one other thing that what you said triggered was that a lot of these plants are patented protected, and so you can't really, you're not supposed to, it's illegal to propagate them. So you can plant them and leave them where they are. If they overwinter, you can, obviously harvest from the second year, but you're not supposed to move them after you've planted them that initial time. And that's important. And with the flowers and removing those, you want to remove those it's recommended to do it for 3 weeks after they start flowering. And that's important so that the plant has time to give energy to the foliage and the roots and really develop a good root system so that you have a good consistent production throughout the whole growing season. And that doesn't just give you a big flush and then have to like rebuild the plant. There's a question about, do you have to do under the plastic to remove the runners? No, they all pretty much go above the plastic. Anything that's underneath the plastic is going to get kind of smothered out anyway. I never really had issues with under the plastic. Yeah.
All right, so let's pivot and talk about low tunnels, because we've mentioned this before. A lot of day neutral strawberries are grown under low tunnels, although some of them are in high tunnels and caterpillar tunnels. So Courtney, do you want to introduce this topic for us?
Sure. Yeah. So low tunnels are really important kind of in the system in that they're protecting your plants. They're creating a microclimate where the only water that the plants are getting is from the drip irrigation. It reduces the water splash that can happen onto the leaves, which can reduce a lot of disease. It can also protect them from critters. It definitely increases the fruit quality and definitely extends the season too. I've had the plastic protect from hail and definitely from frost, especially late in the season. There was a question earlier about planting times that we kind of skipped over. Typically in the Twin Cities, May 15th was about the day that I always was shooting for to get them in the ground by. So if you're south of here, probably you could get them in a little bit sooner. If you're north of here, you probably want to wait just a little bit.
Yeah, I would say if somebody's really gung-ho to plant these this season, you can still do that. Just try to order them ASAP while you're getting your field prepared so that you can still get them in. You really don't want to be going too far into June to be planting these, or you're really reducing your season length.
Yeah, and that was definitely another mistake I made in 2018 is I think we waited a week or week and a half later than I would have liked. So
yeah, because after you plant them, even if you plant them late, after you plant them, you still have to keep removing those flowers for a couple of weeks so that the plants can actually establish. So you have to account for that time.
Yep. And the Du Bois low tunnel system is kind of the gold standard, the fancy system. It's nice because it creates like a retractable low tunnel system, so it makes it really easy to get in and harvest the strawberries and pull the runners. A lot of times we would harvest 2 to 3 times a week, and as we were harvesting, if we saw runners, we would just kind of clip them off and pinch them off at that point. They do have, you want to keep going, keep talking about the components of the system. So the Du Bois system has these wire frames that have little notches at the bottom. They have the stakes that have kind of an anchor hook that go over those notches. They don't go in the notches, they actually go over the notches. The plastic has a perforated on the sides, but not on the top, so you get good airflow even when you have them down all the ways. And then they use an elastic band that goes over those notches on either side to sort of hold the plastic in place and make it so that you can push the plastic up to the shoulder when you're trying to get in there to harvest and weed and do things like that.
Can you explain a little bit more what that second component is?
That's holding, so you push the kind of squarish frame one in, but then you actually anchor it with that second stake. So that hook goes over the little hook that's on the frame. And then the hook that's on the frame also holds the elastic band that goes around.
And just a comment from Lori, who's been using these low tunnels. She says they are the best. However, if you have big wind gusts, there will be some replacement and repair. I'm in my 3rd year and it's worth it. Totally,
I would agree. I love them. I wish we would have had the budget to do them on all the beds that we had. We usually had about enough for half. Just price-wise, these guys, you can get a kit to do 50 feet for $227. They also have a 100-foot kit to do all of the pieces. And then the plastic, we would try to like reuse the plastic for a year or 2. Sometimes it would last maybe 3 years, but that would kind of be pushing it. And the plastic itself, I want to say for a 100-foot row is $75, $80. So it's not a cheap system. but it's worthwhile in terms of increasing your productivity and extending your season. And just the other component that I haven't talked about really about the low tunnels too is that a lot of times the insects that are trying to get into your strawberries, they're like flying over looking for the plants, and they can't find them when they're in these low tunnels, and so it makes it harder. So you actually have an added pest protection as well.
And would you say that you could use the low tunnel plastic multiple years, or do you need to throw that away after 1 year?
So we would usually typically use it for 2 years if it didn't rip or get damaged in wind. I would say 3 would be pushing it, but 2 years is definitely plausible.
All right, thanks.
The other components of the system usually had a metal pipe that sort of anchored the plastic down. At either end of the row, we also had kind of a hoop, half hoop that was covered in kind of a plastic rubber material so that it buffered against the plastic as well. And there you can see kind of in the third picture, it's a little fuzzy, but there's the stake going in over the loop, and you would just go straight down and anchor that hook that was holding the frame in place. And then the plastic going over, and then the elastic holding the plastic in place. And then you'd usually tie off the plastic on the ends on that metal pipe as well.
And Lori said, I'm using some third year, using them for the third year for 75% of them, but we'll have to replace some too after this season. I got a 1,000 foot roll of the plastic, and I have 1,000 feet total of strawberries. So 10 rows of 100 plants each. Awesome.
Nice. Yeah, and I think it's just important to think about covering these and protecting them in general. So using some kind of netting can be helpful in terms of keeping critters and insects out. Remay Agribond is another option that would be a little bit more breathable, or even just regular plastic. You just want to make sure that if you're using plastic that isn't ventilated, that you're creating a ventilation system in there so that the plants aren't getting overheated, because that can happen too.
Yeah, so I feel like with the netting, depending on what grade of netting you're using, you would still get the insect exclusion, and to some extent you might get disease exclusion as well, but I don't think you would get the season extension benefit with netting that you would with the plastic.
Yeah.
Okay, so pathways. There's been a lot of experimentation with what people are using for the pathways in between the rows. What I wouldn't do, which I show on the next slide, is using bare ground. The farmer whose farm I took this photo on, he was establishing a cover crop, but in the meantime, it was a bare row. So that's not something I would really recommend, because I think you're just gonna get a lot of weeds in there. If you're cultivating between the rows all the time, then you're trying to walk through them. They could be wet after a rain, and it's a lot harder to walk on. And so you can do landscape fabric between the rows. You can do just a cheaper weed mat. I know somebody this season who's experimenting with cardboard to see how he likes that. Plastic can be used. You can use straw between the rows. This photo here on the right, they have both landscape fabric with straw on top of it. And then, yeah, so the last option would be bare ground. So cover crop is the first one that I list there. And U of M has been doing a lot of research on organic day neutral strawberries to figure out which cover crops could work the best in those interrows. And obviously, you know, everybody listening has probably thought about the benefits of cover crops for soil health and for walking. If you're walking on those rows, having something like a cover crop is going to be more friendly than walking on bare soil. I do, however, know a farmer in Farmington who's growing day neutral strawberries, and his first year, or maybe it was his first 2 years, he was growing cover crops in between, and he decided to stop doing this. And one of the reasons was he was having to go out all the time with a weed whacker and weed whack those that cover crop. And to him, the amount of gasoline that he was using was just not that was not something he was comfortable doing, using all that gasoline to always be weed whacking. And he didn't want to just leave the cover crops grow very long. Those can attract and keep in a lot of insect pests and some diseases as well. So to him, it was better to just stop doing cover crops and do a landscape fabric in between the rows instead.
And Lori says that she's using white Dutch clover between the rows for customers and pollinators and easy care for people to and mow if needed. I am with you, Lori. I always put clover in between my rows. I loved it. The biggest challenge though is that kind of edge of the bed, especially with the low tunnels in place. Like it was really, really hard to mow up to that edge. I was using a walk behind tractor with a flail mower most of the time when we mowed it. And I thought about like putting like the foam noodle around the edge of it to try to create a bumper so that it wouldn't rip the plastic on the raised beds. On the flat beds, it worked a lot better because the plastic, you could just kind of drive over the edge of it. But that's definitely a challenge, just managing the weeds on that edge. Using cover crops is probably the trickiest part. Larry says we place flakes of straw right up to the weed fabric in the row. So that makes sense. That's where people kneel down. So it's a good option.
Yeah. So we're not trying to tell anybody what to do for their pathways, but giving options and some of the pros and cons, so you can decide what would work best for your farm and your goals. One thing that I wouldn't recommend is using wood chips, because this is an annual system and it's really important to rotate this crop with other crops. So you're usually not going to be planting day neutrals in the same field year after year. So using wood chips would be really difficult in this system. So the picture on the right, I want to pause on this picture for a second. This is in a caterpillar tunnel, and somebody sent me a question before the webinar started about, can you grow these in a caterpillar tunnel? And the answer is yes. So the farmer, this is Little Hill Berry Farm, owned by Aaron Wills, and this was last year when I took this picture, and he just had one caterpillar tunnel of day neutral strawberries, and now he has several. I was out there on Sunday, and I don't remember exactly how many he had, but it's maybe 5 or 6. So to him, he has decided that this is really important for his system. He is an organic farm, and so for disease management, he didn't want to be spraying anything for disease management, and growing under the caterpillar tunnel for him is so important because he says he has virtually no disease when growing in the caterpillar tunnel versus just growing strawberries in an open field without any sort of low tunnel caterpillar or anything on top of it, because a lot of these diseases really propagate with raindrops. So yeah, he's had good success with that.
And there's a question from Matt about what does production look like if you leave it for a second year? Having done that, I would say that the second year you get lower yields. You definitely are dealing with, if you had any disease the previous year, that's going to come back with a flourish, and you're going to have to deal with it again the second year. But it does, I mean, they will produce, if they overwinter, they will produce a second year as well. Typically then you have the added challenge, the organic systems require that you remove the plastic at the end of the first season. So you'd have to pull the plastic up very carefully around the plants and leave the plants in place to make that work. And then you have to figure out what kind of mulch you're doing for that second year, which can be a challenge too.
So you'd probably have to use straw for that second year. And we know that straw gives lower yields, so it might not be worth it.
Yeah, you'd almost be better off if you were going to do it for a second year using landscaping fabric, because you can technically leave the landscaping fabric in place from when you plant until you pull the plants out. And so that would provide better weed suppression and not have to be removed after the end of the first season.
Mm-hmm. All right, so fertilization. So this is the way you fertilize day neutral strawberries is different than with June bearing strawberries. So if you're already planting or already growing June bearing strawberries, try not to think that you're going to do the same fertilizer regimen for day neutrals. The most important take-home message for this is that they focus on smaller applications of nutrients more often for day neutrals, because they are trying to produce that entire season, and that fruit production takes a lot of nutrition. It's recommended to do pre-plant applications of P and K, since those are really not that mobile in the soil, and a lot of our organic fertilizers that we're using release those nutrients slowly. So it's important to incorporate those in about the top 4 to 6 inches of the soil so that the berries can take them up throughout the season. We don't recommend applying nitrogen before planting, but rather apply nitrogen gradually throughout the season. So what's recommended is about 4 to 9 ounces of nitrogen, and that's actual nitrogen, per 100 linear feet of row each month from about June to October. And so obviously, that's actual nitrogen. So the amount of physical fertilizer that you would be putting on would depend on the nitrogen concentration in it, whether you're applying, granulated chicken manure or something else. So there's a really good resource I found that describes this in good detail, and that's one of Cornell's guides on growing day-neutral strawberries. So I provided the link there.
Excellent. My fertilizing trick was always to plant them and water them in with fish emulsion diluted. I just found that also helped kind of give them a good start and have reduced transplant shock.
Okay. All right.
Also, just to go back to the plastic mulch before we jump into the pests, Matt says that he's done plastic mulch the first year and then pulled it up and the plastic had solarized the weeds. Yeah, and then there's a question of, is that linear row, so 2 times per bed for the staggered rows for the fertilization? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I interpret that to be your row. So your double row. Yep.
Sounds good. And then there's a question, is the fish emulsion of 4-1-1 or 5-1-1 or the 2-4? I liked Neptune's Harvest with seaweed. I don't remember which one that was, what the formulation is, but that was always the one that I went for. So going into the pests for strawberries, I'm going to start out with the worst one, which is the spotted wing Drosophila. I would say that they are a moderate pest on strawberries. They definitely go for the raspberries first. In fact, a lot of times we would have lower pressures on the strawberries because I think they went to the raspberries instead of the strawberries. Obviously, the best sort of way that we dealt with this was just harvesting them 2 to 3 times a week so that you had, you were getting all of the ripe berries out of there. The biggest, when you went to pick them, you could tell that they were infected because they had a soft spot that was where the infection was happening. The ovipositor, lays its eggs into the ripening fruit, and then that's not marketable once those hatch. In terms of control for these, Entrust seems to be like the one that growers are using the best with spinosad. Any other thoughts, Annie, on that one?
Sorry, I'm having myself muted while I'm not talking because they're doing construction next door and I can't do anything about that. Sorry. Yeah, so I would add, spinosad has been consistently found as the most effective organic product against spotted wing Drosophila. Entrust, neem oil can be used, but it's only going to be about 25% effective. I would agree with Courtney on the importance of daily or every other day harvest. That is the most common way that Minnesota farmers are controlling spotted wing Drosophila. That's based on intensive survey work to identify what the most common control mechanisms are. So another thing you can try is exclusion netting on your low tunnels, but that's definitely not as common. It is effective, however.
Yeah, and Lori says that they time their berries. They allow for the first berries in May with no flies and then removing the flowers in time for a near to August picking again, and they haven't had any spotted wing in their strawberries yet. So
okay, that's good. And I did give a number of webinars and conference talks on spotted wing Drosophila over the past few months. So I'm happy to share that information or those slides with people over email because there's quite a bit of information out there beyond what we can say in these few minutes.
Yeah. There's a question about, do we worry about pollinators with low tunnels? The pollinators seem to find the flowers just fine. I haven't had any issues with flowers not getting pollinated. Have you heard of that at all?
I haven't heard of issues with that, no.
Yeah. Oh, go back. Yeah, there we go. Japanese beetles, for some reason in 2018, they were just horrendous. They were not as bad last year. That's the picture from our field. They just skeletalized the leaves down to nothing. They were eating fruits, they were eating flowers, they were just going after them with a vengeance. My solution, my organic solution, was to go out there with a little, with that hand vacuum that was battery operated and suck up as many as I could first thing in the morning and late in the afternoon, early evening, and then just dump them in soapy water to drown them all. They're hard to catch, especially when they're low on normally if they were up in a tree, I would, knock them down into a bucket of soapy water, but the vacuum seemed to really be the best, easiest way to manage the Japanese beetles on the strawberry plants.
I love that vacuum technique.
Yeah. Tarnished plant bug can definitely be a big pest with strawberries. They're not very big. They're only a 1/4 inch long. They have the piercing sucking mouth parts that feed on the flowers and the fruits. The good news is that their damage is almost entirely cosmetic. You want to go to the next slide? They do this cat face damage to strawberries. So they sort of deform the strawberries. Luckily, they still taste good. There's no larva inside them unless you've got spotted wing. But the tarnished plant bug really just deforms them and gives them kind of a funky shape. For the most part, I found that these were still pretty marketable and still delicious as well. It's really important in controlling tarnished plant bug to sort of remove the places where they can overwinter and the habitat that they can, as adults, that they can also inhabit. So keeping things mowed, making sure that you're not, having a lot of leaf litter or weeds that they can populate in. If you have a small patch, you can typically, just take the flower and kind of tap them into that and then put them in soapy water. Yeah, and then the last bullet point is not really, you don't renovate day neutral strawberries, so that doesn't really apply. Oh, this is aphids. Aphids, there's numerous species, colors. They're a soft body sucking insect. They can do a little bit of stunting. They're not, I haven't found them to be a huge problem. Neem oil is typically what we would use if they were really, really bad. Next slide. The good news is there's lots of predators to aphids. There's ladybird beetles, there's lacewings, there's cirripid flies, there's actually thrips that will attack them as well. Next slide. And then there's lots of parasitic wasps as well that'll parasitize the aphids. They do a great job of sort of controlling these. So making sure that you have lots of plants nearby with little tiny flowers that can provide the nectar for those parasitic wasps is always really important. That was part of the reason why I just loved the clover and the pathways, because it provided that habitat for those good insects. Yeah. Slugs can be another issue with strawberries. I typically have more issues with slugs when I was trying to grow them on straw than when I was trying to grow them on plastic. But they can, leave little trails on the leaves and on the fruits themselves. They're not like a huge problem typically, but if it's really, high humidity, they can be an issue. Next slide. I often found that like putting out, a board or damp newspaper to kind of trap them worked really well, or putting out beer traps. There was one year where we had like lids full of beer in the rows of strawberries to try to control the slugs.
Generally, having more straw can cause more slugs, especially in really wet years. It's looking like this year so far is going to be drier, so maybe we won't have slug problems as bad.
Yeah.
All right, speaking of things not being as bad when it's not as wet, that applies to diseases too, for sure. So I'm not going to talk super long about diseases. I just want to point out that they can be big problems for day neutral strawberries, especially if you're not growing them under a low tunnel, caterpillar tunnel, or high tunnel. So botrytis, gray mold, powdery mildew, leaf spot, anthracnose, and others, these are all of concerns for day neutral strawberries, just like they are for June bearing strawberries. But the breeders of day neutrals have been trying really hard to breed in good disease resistance. There's one link that I would really recommend to look at for strawberry disease information, which is North Carolina State University. They have a good list of all the diseases where you can go and read more about them and look at management recommendations too. But I'll just give a few photos. So this is what botrytis gray mold looks like. If you've been growing strawberries already, you're familiar with what this looks like. So what I want to say about botrytis gray mold is rain is very important to the spread of this disease, like it is for many diseases. Rain droplets fall on the straw or whatever detritus and soil cover crop is growing, and then those droplets can splash up It's amazing how much a rain droplet can splash once it actually hits the ground. We don't see it, but it's happening. And when it splashes, it's bringing disease spores from the ground or from the straw onto the plants that it then falls on. And so that's how those diseases spread onto plants. They really rely on rain. So if we can keep out the rain, then we keep out a lot of diseases. Powdery mildew, here's another example. Okay, there's something really interesting about powdery mildew, which is that it does rely on moisture in order to start growing, but then it wants it to be sort of dry from then on out for it to continue growing on the plant. If we have a season where it's really, really rainy throughout the season, that rain actually can impede the spread of powdery mildew. So it likes sort of different conditions that a lot of other diseases do. Strawberry leaf spot, this is what that looks like, extremely common on berries. People who are already growing strawberries are well familiar with this. It takes a lot of leaf spot damage to actually impact the yield on the fruit, because it would take the leaves to actually start curling up and dying to slow photosynthesis and create a less healthy patch. It's still good to rotate plants in order to decrease the spread of this so that it does not become severe. So this table, I'm not trying to say everybody should memorize the information on this table because it's a lot, but this is an example of the information that you can find in the Organic Production and IPM guide for strawberries that Cornell has put out. This is a really great guide. I think it's really easy to read and it gives good information. So if you see a disease out in your field, you can go to UMN Extension's website and use the what's wrong with my plant tool to identify what disease you're seeing, but then you can go, I recommend going to this Cornell guide to get control recommendations. So these are organic methods, organic fungicides, pesticides for different diseases. So this is the table that shows the options labeled for leaf blight. And so it's showing what the product is, what the rate is, and then the pre-harvest interval, the re-entry interval in hours, and the relative efficacy or effectiveness of the product. So you can see for leaf blight, a lot of the products that are available, they only have a 1 for efficacy out of 4. Oops. So they're relatively not very effective, meaning that it's really important for organic systems for certain diseases to do cultural management strategies, such as planting in well-drained soil, planting in full sunlight, of course, rotating, meaning changing the location of your strawberries each year. And then if you use something like a low tunnel or a caterpillar tunnel, that really can decrease the amount of disease that you're seeing because you don't have all those raindrops coming in. And then using drip irrigation instead of overhead watering is very important as well. So I would say in organic systems in general, you can definitely use organically approved fungicides, but I wouldn't rely on that as your main strategy for management. So,
yeah, some of our key points. So day neutrals have the benefits of high yields and a spread out season, definitely even beginning of July through frost. There have been a couple years where we had strawberries at Thanksgiving when that frost was really late. It was amazing, pretty magical. They may or may not overwinter in Minnesota. They're not being touted for their winter hardiness here. But they are, because you're growing them as an annual, that's usually not typically the goal anyway. They are typically patent protected, so you want to make sure that you're following the rules in terms of not moving them once you've planted them. Low tunnel protection is definitely beneficial, and insect and disease management is important. And I would also add that like the irrigation with the timer, super crucial. Cutting those runners as they appear is also really important, and then making sure that you pick the flowers for the first 3 weeks just to make sure that you have a really big, healthy, happy plant to produce for the whole season is really important too.
all right.
We have a couple questions it looks like already. Has anyone in Minnesota successfully planted in plastic in a high tunnel and heated it through the winter to keep producing berries for winter markets, restaurants, etc.? Do you know of anybody who's doing that?
I don't. I think that's a really cool idea if it could work, but I don't know of anybody who has tried that, so I'm not sure if they've had it work or not. Do you?
I feel like I've seen people trying it in winter high tunnels or winter
deep winter greenhouses.
Greenhouses, yeah. I feel like I've seen like the strawberries. I feel like Carol Ford was playing around with that a little bit. I don't know how successful it was, but I feel like that system I've definitely heard of.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know that Bushel Boy is producing day neutral strawberries year round in their greenhouses. I do believe they're using hydroponics, so.
Yeah. And Linda has a question about economic studies with the cost of cultural systems, cost of labor. It seems questionable that it's actually very profitable.
So this is, there have been economic studies on this from UMM, Cornell, North Carolina, various other places that have found that it can be very profitable. Yes, the input cost is higher, but your yields that you're getting out of this are substantially higher than you're going to be getting with June-bearing strawberries. If you're getting 1.5 pounds per plant, and that's spread throughout the growing season. Oh, what else was I going to say? Oh, there was another study, I think it was a University of Minnesota study, but I will look into it, that found that it can be the most profitable high tunnel crop. Now, that's just one study that found that. So I would want to get you more details on that. But my point is that people who have looked at this have found that it can be very profitable. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the input costs of it are very high. So, I mean, I would recommend somebody doesn't go out and plant, 5 acres of this. I think that would be very high risk if you've never done it before. I think though, planting a few rows, maybe a few 50 or 100 foot rows and seeing how you like it would be worth it. One farmer who I work with who has day neutral strawberries, he is not using low tunnels. He's just growing them open field. He is organic. He is the only person who is managing his crop. He doesn't have employees. And for him, he had half an acre this past year. And he says for one person who's doing this mostly full time and then selling at farmer's market a couple times a week, half an acre is all he can manage between going out and harvesting every day, going back and forth to the farmer's market, doing disease control organically, and just, yeah, all the mowing the cover crop in between the rows. He really said that half an acre is what he can do as one person.
Yeah, and I would say, I think typically we had about 1/8 of an acre and could yield, do like $9,000 in sales of strawberries off of that eighth of an acre.
Did you say $9,000 in sales off of an eighth of an acre?
Yeah, and we were typically selling most of those on campus in pint containers for $5 a pint. Yeah.
I've seen them up to $7 a pint.
Oh yeah, so have I.
Market.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Especially when it gets into August and you're the only vendor selling strawberries. Yeah.
Yeah. And Lori says she agrees with it. They have a total of 1/4 acre, 1,000 plants, a pound per yield, and it's just her, no employees. So yeah.
I would be curious if Lori's comfortable sharing if you find this profitable or if you find it worth the investment, if you care to share. Somebody is asking, what is the white contraption in that picture? I didn't notice that when I used this photo, so I don't know exactly what it is. I'm guessing it's some sort of trap for monitoring insects. That's usually what things like that are.
It could also be, I'm trying to remember, Andy had some of those early on, and I'm trying to remember what they were. It's a monitor of some sort.
Yeah.
Temperature? I don't remember.
Maybe.
Yeah. There's a question about what does the harvest look like over the season, and is there a curve? I would say it's pretty consistent throughout the season. It definitely has a little bit of a bump up kind of in the middle. But it's pretty consistent over the course of the season. It starts out maybe a little bit slow, but then builds up. Yeah. The
data from the University of Minnesota study, which included the organic farm, they found that the peak was in August.
Mm-hmm.
And then Lori says, yes, it is going well. It's a bit of a setup for sure, but so definitely plan it out first. And then she says that will go a long way. I'm assuming she means that planning it out first will go a long way.
Yep, definitely.
And so the recorded version of the presentation will be sent out to everyone who registered, whether they attended or not. And then I can share the slides as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Annie.
Well, thank you. And we're exactly at 1 o'clock. Wow. All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. See you later, Courtney. I'm going to close it out.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.